the headless men. Herodotus composed his histories during the 5th century BC, fundamentally transforming how the ancient world perceived itself. He meticulously documented civilizations, wars, and the boundaries of the known earth with a level of detail that established him as the foundational figure of historical scholarship. However, strict precision was not always his primary concern. Scattered throughout his monumental work are descriptions of people so anatomically impossible and strange that historians have spent centuries debating whether he truly believed his own writing or simply could not overlook the extraordinary tales he encountered. Among all the peculiar peoples he recorded, one group stands out. He referred to them as the Achaeoi, the headless ones. According to Herodotus, the Achaeoi inhabited the outer fringes of Libya, at the furthest margins of the world that the Greeks could conceptually reach. They were not depicted as monsters in a traditional sense, but were described as functioning, living human beings whose faces were not located on a head above their shoulders. Instead, their features were embedded directly into their chests. Their eyes were positioned in their pectoral region, and their mouths opened across what should have been their sternum. Herodotus did not present this as mere rumor. He recorded it as a geographical fact. In the same manner, he documented the paths of rivers or the traditions of Persian kings. Later, the Roman writer Pliny the Elder inherited this tradition and provided these people with a new name, calling them the Blemmies. What makes this detail particularly unsettling is that the Blemmies were not entirely mythological. There was a real tribal group known as the Blemmies, documented as living south of Egypt along the Nile corridor. They were a recognized historical population that built structures and maintained political ties with Rome. They existed, yet nothing in any verified historical record suggests their anatomy was anything other than completely normal. Their heads were exactly where heads are expected to be. This raises a question that no ancient scholar ever answered satisfactorily. Why would a real people with a documented presence in a known geography become the vessel for a story about facial features migrating to the chest? The distinction between the actual Blemmies and the mythological Blemmies became a boundary that medieval cartographers refused to respect. On maps produced across Europe throughout the Middle Ages, headless men appeared at the edges of Africa as matter-of-factly as mountain ranges. As European knowledge of Africa grew and the headless men failed to appear, their supposed homeland shifted eastward. The mystery moved along with the mapmakers. By the time Sir Walter Raleigh sailed to Guyana in the late 16th century, the headless tribe had crossed an entire ocean. Raleigh recorded local accounts of a people called the Iwai Panoma living beside a river in South America. Their description was identical, faces in their chests and no heads. Raleigh did not claim to have seen them personally, but he insisted the reports were credible. 2,000 years of testimony spanning 3 continents, yet no physical evidence was ever found. The man-eaters. The ancient Greeks were among the most intellectually restless civilizations in recorded history. They constructed systems of philosophy, government, mathematics, and medicine that continue to echo through modern institutions. However, their curiosity did not stop at the borders of their own familiar world. It pushed outward into territories they had never visited, toward peoples they had only heard about through the accounts of merchants, soldiers, and sailors. Stories that grew stranger the further from home they originated. The Greeks categorized the world they knew and the world they imagined with equal seriousness. Among all the categories of strange peoples they documented, none disturbed them more deeply than those who consumed human flesh. Herodotus introduced them by name, calling them the Androphagi, a name drawn directly from Greek roots that meant, without ambiguity, man-eaters. He did not place them at the absolute edge of mythology. Instead, he positioned them geographically in the regions north of Scythia, in the vast steppe territories stretching beyond the Black Sea, into what is today roughly the area of modern Russia and Central Asia. He described them not as monsters with unusual anatomy, but as recognizable bipedal human beings whose defining characteristic was their diet. He wrote with unusual directness about their customs, stating that their manners were more savage than those of any other race he had documented. For a writer who recorded peoples across 3 continents, that was a significant claim. What distinguished the Androphagi in Herodotus's account was not merely that they consumed human flesh on occasion or in ritual contexts. He described it as a fundamental aspect of their lifestyle, a dietary and cultural practice that separated them from every other group he had encountered or recorded. He offered no explanation for the origin of the practice, no mythological framework, and no divine justification. He presented it the same way he presented the agricultural habits of the Egyptians or the burial customs of the Persians, as observation, as fact. Pliny the Elder, writing several centuries later, embedded the androphagi within a broader taxonomy of extreme eaters. He listed them alongside the agriophagi, who subsisted primarily on the flesh of panthers and lions, and the pymphagi, a group he described as consuming anything at all without restriction. Within this catalog of dietary extremity, the human flesh eaters occupied a specific and deliberate position. They were not the only ones with disturbing eating habits, but they were the ones whose habits implicated their fellow human beings as the meal. The psychological weight of the androphagi legend persisted for centuries, precisely because it required no supernatural element, no dog heads or missing skulls, just people organized into a functioning society who had crossed the one dietary boundary that virtually every human culture treats as absolute. Herodotus never claimed to have met them. He recorded what he was told, yet that distinction never seemed to diminish the fear. The dog-headed tribe. The ancient world had a complicated relationship with the boundaries between human and animal. Egyptian temples were filled with depictions of gods bearing the heads of jackals, ibises, and crocodiles, imagery that modern scholars interpret as symbolic representations of divine attributes rather than literal anatomical claims. However, not every ancient writer was trafficking in metaphor. Some were making what they believed to be straightforward ethnographic observations. Among those observers was a Greek physician named Ctesias, and the people he described were not gods. They were, by his account, an entire civilization of dog-headed human beings living in the mountains of India. Ctesias was not a casual storyteller. He served as the personal physician to the Persian king Artaxerxes II in the late 5th century BC, a position that gave him direct access to the royal archives of the Persian Empire. He spent years in Persia and claimed his accounts of India and Persia were drawn from those official records rather than from traveler gossip. This institutional grounding gave his writings a weight that pure mythology never carried. When he described the cynocephaly, he was not writing fantasy. He was filing what he considered to be a report. According to Ctesias, the cynocephaly were a mountain-dwelling people of India, numbering in the tens of thousands. They communicated not through language but through howls and barks. Yet he was insistent on a detail that made them impossible to dismiss as mere animals. They were intelligent. They were reasonable, understood social structures, conducted trade using gestures, and lived in organized communities. They wore animal skins, subsisted on game, and possessed a moral code. Ctesias described them as neither beast nor fully human, but as something occupying a precise and deliberate space between the two. Other ancient writers extended the geography of the cynocephaly further west, relocating them to Africa, as if the dog-headed people were a cultural constant that simply needed a continent assigned to them. What makes the cynocephaly legend particularly difficult to close is what happened to it in the Christian medieval tradition. Saint Christopher, one of the most widely venerated martyrs in early Christianity, appears in certain Eastern Orthodox and medieval European icons with the unmistakable head of a dog. Scholars studying this iconographic anomaly have traced it to what appears to be a translation error of remarkable consequence. The Latin word Cananeus, meaning from Canaan, describing Christopher's supposed geographic origin, was misread or miscopied as Cananeus, meaning dog-like. A single letter difference in a copied manuscript in a saint grew a snout. The error was never universally corrected. Entire religious traditions incorporated the dog-headed Christopher without apparent theological crisis. Missionaries reported encountering dog-headed peoples in territories as far apart as the Far East and Sub-Saharan Africa across several centuries. No specimen was ever produced, no skeleton, no confirmed sighting, only the persistent cross-cultural insistence that somewhere in the mountains they existed. The Gorgads women. Pliny the Elder was not a man given to idle speculation. He spent decades assembling what he intended to be a complete account of all human knowledge, a project of such ambition that it produced 37 volumes covering geography, zoology, botany, medicine, and the full range of natural phenomena observable in the ancient world. His natural history was not a collection of myths. It was meant to be a reference text, the definitive record of what the Roman world knew and had verified. When Pliny included something in that work, he was making an implicit claim about its credibility, which is precisely what makes his account of the Gorgades so difficult to dismiss and so impossible to resolve. According to Pliny, the Gorgades were a set of islands situated off the Atlantic coast of Africa, beyond the familiar boundaries of the Mediterranean world. The people living there were women, and these women were covered from head to foot in thick fur. They were not dressed in animal skins or adorned with ceremonial coverings, but were biologically, naturally, and entirely covered in hair the way an animal would be. Pliny recorded this as geographical and anthropological fact, using the same register he used to describe the coastlines of Britain or the feeding habits of elephants. But Pliny was not the first to write about these islands. A century before his account, the Roman geographer Pomponius Mela described the Gorgades with details that pushed the story further into territory that defied biological explanation. In Mela's version, the islands were populated exclusively by these hairy women. There were no men. The population reproduced without male involvement, a claim that placed the Gorgades not merely in the category of the strange, but in the category of the biologically unprecedented. Mela described the women as savage and physically powerful, possessing a strength that made them dangerous to approach. The only way to subdue them, according to his account, was through chains. They could not be reasoned with, bargained with, or restrained by ordinary human force. The story might have remained a geographic curiosity were it not for one detail that introduced a physical object into the chain of evidence. Pliny recorded that the Carthaginian explorer Hanno the Navigator had actually visited the Gorgades during his famous voyage along the African coast, a voyage that historical records confirmed did take place in approximately the 5th century BC. To prove what he had witnessed, Hanno allegedly brought back with him the preserved skins of two of these hairy women. He reportedly hung them as trophies in a temple in Carthage, where they remained on display for years. This was physical evidence publicly exhibited in a named location. No trace of those skins survives, and no independent account confirms their existence in the temple. But the question they raise has never been fully closed. If Hanno brought back genuine skins from a creature encountered on the African Atlantic coast, the most plausible explanation is that he had encountered a species of ape, possibly a gorilla, at a time when no such animal had entered the European taxonomic record. The word gorilla itself may carry the echo of that encounter. The mouthless people. Pliny the Elder developed what can only be described as a professional obsession with the extremes of human consumption. Across the 37 volumes of his natural history, he returned repeatedly to the question of what different peoples ate, how they ate it, and what their dietary habits revealed about their place in the broader order of the natural world. He documented peoples who ate lions, peoples who ate anything at all, and peoples who ate human flesh. Each account pushed the boundary of what Roman readers considered possible. But among all the dietary extremes Pliny cataloged across a lifetime of research and compilation, none were as anatomically radical as the people he placed near the source of the Ganges River in India. He called them the Astomi. They had no mouths. The absence of a mouth was not presented as a deformity or a medical anomaly. It was presented as a species characteristic, a defining biological feature of an entire population living in a specific geographic location that Pliny identified with the same confidence he applied to documented territories. The Astomi did not merely avoid certain foods or observe dietary restrictions of a cultural or religious nature. They were structurally incapable of eating. The mechanism by which every other known human population sustained itself simply did not exist in their anatomy. Yet they lived, they thrived, they traveled, and they survived. Their sustenance came entirely through smell. According to Pliny, the Astomi absorbed the scents of flowers and fruit and derived from those scents whatever the human body requires to continue functioning. They required no digestion, no ingestion, and no physical contact between food and body. The aromatic compounds released by blossoms and ripened fruit pass through their respiratory system and sustain them completely. This was not described as a spiritual practice or a meditative discipline. It was described as their biological reality, as straightforward and unremarkable to them as the act of chewing was to a Roman citizen eating bread. The practical implications of this physiology shaped every aspect of their lives. When the Ostomi needed to travel beyond the flowering regions near the Ganges, they could not simply pack provisions the way any other traveler would. They carried perfumed objects, scented materials whose fragrance could be accessed throughout a long journey to provide the energy their bodies required. Pliny described this as a known and documented practice, a detail specific enough to suggest it came from a source rather than pure imagination. But the same sensitivity that sustained them also threatened them. Strong odors of the wrong character were not merely unpleasant to the Ostomi, they were lethal. A sufficiently harsh or corrupted smell could kill a mouthless person the way a poison consumed by mouth could kill anyone else. Their entire biological vulnerability existed in the same channel as their only source of nourishment. No anatomy supports their existence, and no archaeological record places them near the Ganges. Yet Pliny wrote it down as knowledge. The tiny warriors. The ancient world did not treat small people as a curiosity to be noted and moved past. It treated them as a category, a recurring and geographically distributed type of human being whose existence was assumed as confidently as the existence of any other population. From the earliest surviving Greek literature through the encyclopedic works of Roman natural historians, diminutive tribes appeared on multiple continents in multiple climates with consistent behavioral and physical characteristics that different writers, working independently across centuries, described in remarkably similar terms. This was not one man's account of one strange encounter. This was a sustained, cross-cultural, multi-generational conviction that small human beings, far smaller than any normally proportioned person, lived at the edges of the known world and had been living there for a very long time. Homer introduced them in the Iliad, the foundational text of Greek literary culture, placing the pygmies in eternal armed conflict with cranes. This was not a metaphor or a fable inserted for color. Aristotle, the most rigorous analytical mind of the ancient world, read that passage and accepted it as zoological and anthropological fact. His endorsement carried enormous weight. Aristotle added his own details, describing the pygmies as underground dwellers who rode horses scaled appropriately to their stature. The combination of Homer's literary authority and Aristotle's scientific credibility created a foundation for the pygmy tradition that subsequent writers built upon without apparent skepticism. Pliny the Elder distributed pygmy populations across the full breadth of the known world. He placed them in Africa and in India. The Indian pygmies, according to his measurements, stood no more than 27 inches tall, roughly the height of a large infant by modern standards. Their conflict with cranes had a practical explanation in Pliny's account that stripped away any mythological ambiguity. The pygmies ate crane eggs. The cranes understandably objected. The resulting warfare was not symbolic. It was a resource conflict between two populations competing for the same territory, with the pygmies reportedly riding into battle on the backs of rams because no horse of standard dimensions could have served them. Pliny also noted that the pygmies consumed their eggs strategically, targeting unhatched birds before they could grow large enough to mount an effective counterattack. The account that introduced physical observation into the tradition came from Nonnus, a diplomat and explorer of the 6th century AD, who traveled the Red Sea region on official Byzantine business. He reported visiting an island off the Ethiopian coast where a pygmy population actually lived. His description was specific. They were unclothed, their bodies were covered in hair, and critically, they were profoundly fearful of taller visitors, fleeing immediately upon contact rather than engaging. The behavioral detail Nonnus recorded is the one that refuses to disappear cleanly. Fear of larger humans, hair-covered bodies, small stature, and island habitation off the Ethiopian coast. Those coordinates have never stopped being interesting. The all-ear people. The ancient world measured strangeness on a spectrum, and somewhere near the far end of that spectrum sat the question of proportion. A human being with features arranged differently, with anatomy inverted, absent, or doubled, represented one category of the impossible. but a human being built entirely correctly, with every expected feature in every expected location, whose single distinguishing characteristic was the extreme, non-functional exaggeration of one ordinary body part, occupied a different and in some ways more unsettling category. The Panati were not missing anything, nor were they arranged wrongly. They simply had ears, ears so large and so dramatically oversized relative to every other feature of their bodies, that the ears themselves became their primary identifying characteristic, their most practical tool, and their only necessary garment. The name said everything. Panati derived directly from the Greek words meaning all ears. It was a designation so literal it functioned less as a tribal name and more as a biological description filed under a proper noun. Pliny the Elder recorded them with the same matter-of-fact register he applied to every other population at the edges of the known world. Their ears were not merely large in the way that some human ears are proportionally larger than average. They were large enough to wrap around the entire body. On cold nights, the Panati did not reach for animal skins or woven cloth. They folded their own ears around themselves and slept inside them. The ears functioned as blankets, as shelter, and as insulation against the cold of wherever they lived. Pomponius Mela placed their homeland on an island in the far north of Europe, a geography consistent with the kind of cold that would make such a biological feature not merely strange but genuinely useful. Pliny did not limit his large ear documentation to the Panati alone. He described separately a population in India whose ears were so enormous that they covered the entire body, ears that functioned not as occasional cold weather accessories, but as permanent full-body coverings in the manner of a garment that could never be removed. The exaggeration had escalated from the merely remarkable to the anatomically total. But it was through Ctesias, the Greek physician whose Persian court access lent his accounts a weight that casual travelers could not claim, that the large-eared tradition acquired its most specific and most layered entry. Ctesias wrote about an Indian tribe called the Pandai, whose characteristics accumulated in ways that made them remarkable on multiple counts simultaneously. They were covered entirely in white fur that darkened to black as they aged, a detail that inverted the normal human experience of hair color, changing from dark to light across a lifetime. They possessed 8 fingers and 8 toes rather than the standard 10, but their ears were the feature that connected them most directly to the broader tradition. The ears of the Pandai hung down to the elbow, long enough to swing with movement and long enough to function as appendages in their own right. 3 writers, multiple continents assigned, and the ears kept growing with every retelling. No skeleton bearing oversized auditory structures has ever been recovered from Northern Europe or the Indian subcontinent. The ears, it seems, existed only on the page. The backward-footed. Alexander the Great did not conquer the Persian Empire and push into India simply as a military exercise. He advanced with the deliberate infrastructure of an intellectual project. Embedded within his army of tens of thousands were scholars, geographers, botanists, and philosophers whose specific assignment was documentation. Every new territory entered, every unfamiliar people encountered, and every strange plant, animal, or geological formation observed was meant to be recorded and carried back to the Greek world as knowledge. This was empire building and knowledge building simultaneously. The records produced by Alexander's scholarly corps became foundational texts for subsequent generations of writers attempting to map the full extent of human diversity. Most of what they brought back was verifiable, some of it was extraordinary, and some of it described things that have never been explained. Among Alexander's men was a surveyor and explorer named Baton, whose specific assignment was the investigation of the mountain passes leading deeper into India. Baton was not a mythologist or a poet. He was a practical man charged with a practical task, mapping terrain and cataloging what lived within it. What he reported finding in one particular valley in those mountain passes was not a geographical feature or an unusual mineral deposit. It was a population of human beings whose feet were attached to their legs in reverse orientation. The heels faced forward and the toes faced backward. Every step they took was biomechanically inverted compared to every other walking human being in the known world. Pliny the Elder, who preserved Baton's account in his Natural History, did not treat this as cause to dismiss the report. He recorded it alongside the physical detail that made the backward feet impossible to write off as a simple deformity, rendering these people helpless. The Aberraman, as they came to be known, moved with remarkable speed. Their reversed anatomy did not impair them. It may, by some accounts, have enhanced their mobility across the specific terrain of their valley. A population that had evolved or developed alongside a particular landscape, moving through it at speed despite or because of an anatomy that would have been catastrophically disabling anywhere else, was a detail too specific and too counterintuitive to have been casually invented. The account carried an additional layer that transformed the Aberraman from a curiosity into something approaching a philosophical problem. Baton discovered that it was impossible to bring any of these people back to present them to Alexander. The reason was not their speed, their resistance, or any political or military obstacle. The Aberraman could not survive outside their valley. The air of that specific place was the only air their respiratory systems could process. Removed from it, they could not breathe. They were biologically bound to a single geography in a way that no other known human population had ever been documented to be. Alexander never saw them. No one outside that valley ever confirmed them, and the valley's location was never definitively recorded. The one-eyed thieves. Herodotus was never content to simply describe what human beings were doing. He was equally fascinated by the systems of the natural world, the strange creatures that inhabited the outer regions of the earth, and most particularly the way wealth moved through those systems. Gold occupied a specific and recurring position in his cosmology of the strange. He wrote about ants the size of dogs in India that excavated gold from the earth as a byproduct of their burrowing, creatures whose mining activity produced treasure as casually as ordinary ants produce hills. The gold-digging ants were not his only entry in this category. At the northern edge of the known world, in the vast territories beyond Scythia, that Greek geography could gesture toward but never fully map, a different kind of creature guarded a different accumulation of wealth. They were griffins, half eagle, half lion, and they were sitting on gold. Herodotus was candid about the limits of his knowledge regarding the northern gold. He acknowledged that the far north contained more gold than any other region of the earth, but admitted he could not explain how it was obtained or by whom. What he did know, or what he recorded as known, was that griffins collected and guarded it. The griffin tradition was not unique to Herodotus. It appeared across multiple ancient cultures with enough consistency to suggest it was drawing on a shared source rather than independent invention. Some modern scholars have proposed that the griffin legend may have originated with nomadic peoples of Central Asia, encountering the fossilized skulls of Protoceratops dinosaurs, whose beaked skulls and four-limbed skeletons bear a suggestive resemblance to the classical griffin form. If that hypothesis holds, the guardians of the northern gold may have been ancient bones misread by living eyes. But the griffins were not the center of the story. The center of the story was who was trying to take the gold from them. Herodotus identified them as the Arimaspi. They were human, or human enough to be classified alongside other tribal peoples in his account. They lived in the far north in geographic proximity to the Scythians, the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, whom Herodotus documented extensively and with considerable accuracy. The relationship between the Arimaspi and the Scythians was close enough that ancient Greek vase painters, when depicting battles between the Arimaspi and the Griffins, consistently dressed the Arimaspi in Scythian clothing. They were not strangers from an alien world. They were neighbors of a known people, distinguished by a single anatomical feature that separated them from every other human population, Herodotus described. They had one eye centered in the middle of the forehead, a single functional eye where two should have been. They used that eye to find griffin gold, and they spent their existence in conflict over it. No skull bearing a centered orbital socket has ever been recovered from the Eurasian steppe. The single-footed. Physical disadvantage in the taxonomy of ancient strange peoples was rarely presented as simply that. The writers who cataloged the tribes at the edges of the known world had a consistent tendency to pair anatomical impossibility with compensatory ability, as if nature, in taking something away, always provided something extraordinary in return. The headless men had their features arranged for function, and the backward-footed moved with surprising speed. Similarly, the monopods, people possessing a single enormous foot, where two ordinary ones should have been, were not hobbled by their singular anatomy. They were, by every ancient account that preserved their story, remarkably fast, surprisingly agile, and in possession of a relationship with their own body that turned what should have been a catastrophic biological limitation into something that functioned under the right conditions as a distinct advantage. Pliny the Elder preserved their story and attributed it explicitly to Ctesias, the Greek physician whose access to Persian royal archives gave his accounts an institutional weight that pure mythology never carried. In Pliny's rendering, the monopods were also called cyopods, a name drawn from the Greek words for shadow and foot. The name was not decorative. It described the most vivid and frequently repeated detail in every account of these people. When the heat of the land they inhabited became unbearable, and the land was described as intensely hot and relentlessly sunny, the monopods would lie flat on their backs, raise their single enormous foot directly above their bodies, and rest in the shade it cast. Their foot was large enough to function as a parasol. Their one apparent disadvantage became, in the hottest hours of the day, their most practical possession. The image was striking enough to travel. The monopod lying on its back beneath its own raised foot became one of the most reproduced visual motifs in medieval mappamundi, the elaborate world maps that Christian cartographers produced to document the full geographic and human extent of creation. At the edges of those maps, where the known world gave way to speculation, the monopod appeared reliably alongside headless men and dog-headed peoples as a standard marker of the territory beyond comprehension. Artists and cartographers who had never read Pliny or Ctesias reproduced the image because it had become part of the inherited visual language of the world's edges. But it was a Christian theologian who pushed the monopod tradition into its most philosophically consequential territory. St. Augustine, one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Christianity, turned his attention to the question that the existence of beings like the monopods necessarily raised for a faith built on the singular origin of humanity. If all human beings descended from Adam, and if creatures like the monopods existed and possessed human reason, then the logic of Christian theology required that they too descended from Adam and therefore carried souls. Augustine did not dismiss them, he reasoned through them. A single foot, an immortal soul. The map's edge pressed against the boundaries of doctrine, and doctrine did not flinch. If these chronicles of the world's forgotten edges have changed the way you perceive the mysteries of our past, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to unearthing the history that time and myth have attempted to obscure. Continue to cultivate your curiosity and help us grow the future of discovery. The next treasury of ancient secrets will soon be revealed.